Welcome back to Cooking with Miss Stockton, and today's recipe is chocolate cupcakes. And for your recipe today, I have a special guest. Her name is Lisa Mount, and she was one of the original bakers at the Buttery Bakery here in Santa Cruz, California. She'll be walking you through the recipe and giving you all sorts of special tips.
Hi, and I am very excited to be taking you through this recipe today. This is one of my favorite recipes. One thing I love about it is it's easy to do in small batches, but even when I do wedding cakes, I can do it in large batches because it does not need a mixer, and it's very friendly in the way that you're mixing it together. So as you'll see, this may become your classic chocolate cake recipe. It is for me. You're going to be needing the ingredients listed on your recipe sheet, but I try and think of it as 3 containers of ingredients. I'm going to show you. In the saucepan, you'll melt the butter, put the water, some oil, and some cocoa. In your bowl are your dry ingredients that you'll sift together: the flour, the sugar, the baking soda, the salt. And in another bowl, you'll have your other wet ingredients, being your buttermilk and your eggs and your vanilla. So I think of it this way: 4 ingredients in here, 4 ingredients in here, and 3 ingredients in here. And then you'll put them together, barely mix them together without a mixer, and you'll have your cake batter. All right, so we're gonna start with the ingredients that you put together over the stove top that you're going to be heating up. And in that, as you look at your recipe, and you'll see, is the butter, 2 ounces, half a stick of butter. So I'm going to put that in my saucepan. There we go. It doesn't matter if it's soft or not because I'm going to be melting it. And then you put in half a cup of cold water. Feels counterintuitive to put water like that in a cake, but that's what we're doing. And then it's a 1/4 cup of vegetable oil. And you know, when you measure with liquid, I'm sure as Miss Stockton has told you, you always want to use a liquid measuring cup, and you want to make sure that it's eye level. Because if I'm up here, it looks like I have more than a 1/4 cup. So I always want to make sure I'm checking down below to make sure it's the right amount. And whenever I'm measuring something liquid, I want to scrape it out with the spatula, because it's amazing how much can get just left in your cup, and then you really don't have the exact amount. You know, in the bakery, we would measure liquid ingredients this way, but with dry ingredients, we would never measure with a measuring cup. It's all done by weight to make sure things are so exact. And you're dealing with large, 20 pounds of flour for a batch of cakes because you're making so many at one time. So it's always through weight, which if you have the opportunity to bake with a scale, it's just much more precise. And as I mentioned, I put my cocoa powder in with my water, my oil, and my butter. But an alternative, and the way I believe it's written in your recipe, is you can sift it in with the dry ingredients. Either way is totally fine. I'm just going to scrape to make sure I have all the cocoa powder out. And then what I'm going to do is heat this until it's all melted together. Of course, I wouldn't use a rubber spatula over the stovetop. I'm using a wooden spoon. And the main thing is I don't want it to boil over. I want the butter to melt. I want to make sure it's all mixed together. So now that I have my ingredients on the stovetop, which remember is the butter, the water, the oil, and the cocoa powder, I'm now going to mix what I'm considering my wet ingredients, which is the 1/4 cup of buttermilk, half a teaspoon of vanilla, and an egg. And by the way, if you wanted to make a 2-layer 8-inch cake, you would just double this recipe. If you want to make a wedding cake, like I did for my daughter's wedding, it's like 20 times as much, depending on the size of the cake, of course. But just to know that you can use your math skills and make larger or smaller batches of this. So I've got my buttermilk. I'm making sure I'm scraping my liquid measuring cup. And there's some people that will use liquid measuring cup for dry ingredients. If you do that, you just really can't get an exact measure. So I really encourage you, if possible, to use a wet ingredient wet measuring cup for wet ingredients and the dry for the dry. But anyway, I've got my egg, I've got my buttermilk, and now I'm going to do my vanilla, which is a half a teaspoon. And I'm actually going to measure it over here because I don't know if this ever happens to you, but sometimes I'll pour too much and it'll go pouring down and I'll have way too much vanilla and there's no way to pull it out, you know, once it's in the recipe. So, oh, see, that just happened right there. So then I'm going to put it back in, put it over here. And then I like to mix this up with a wire whisk, which I have one right here. This up. And one thing I love about this recipe is I think of myself as I'm mixing all that up. I'm mixing all this up, all the wet ingredients. And then I'm going to mix my dry ingredients up. So when I put it all together, I barely have to mix it all. And that's super important because, as I'm sure you know, you overmix, the gluten in the flour will develop, and that's going to make it dry and tough. And the baking soda, the leavening we're going to put in there to make it rise, all the carbon dioxide gets let off before it gets into the oven, and your cake won't rise. So I can mix this as much as I want, and I can mix that as much as I want, and I can mix the dry as much as I want. But when I put them together, I want to mix as little as possible. And now we're into the third, of the 3 containers I mentioned before. I mentioned the stovetop, I mentioned the wet, and now I get to mix together the dry. And I used to think, I look at a recipe, I look at all this stuff, what's the difference if I just dump it all in at once or I put it in, like they say? It really does make a difference. Because of the way that the ingredients, act together. Right now what I'm going to do is I'm going to sift together the dry, and I do that just using a sieve. And actually at the bakery, we had a giant French sieve that we would put the dry ingredients and shake it to make it all sift together. So even in the bakery we did it. And Miss Stockton, who's one of my closest friends, she pre-measured the cup of flour and the cup of sugar for me. And then I have the baking soda and the salt. And by sifting them together, I'm really going to get a nice mix on them, but I might mix them a little more. I mean, if you look at a cake recipe, a traditional like butter cake, it's much more complicated than this recipe. They have you put the dry and the wet and the dry and the wet. This recipe is so much easier that it just becomes an easy go-to. So I would just highly recommend it. And then I'm actually just going to, it's all white, so how do you tell if it's really mixed together, right? It's kind of like stirring a can of paint. You can actually see with a can of paint how much it really takes to stir something to get it to mix together. But with a bunch of flour and sugar, you can't tell that, so really want to mix it well. If I do not mix that baking soda well, and I've seen this happen, these tunnels form in your cake. And you have no idea what has happened, but it's really because all these ingredients, the baking soda was not sifted together enough, and this happened at the bakery, and it's made these giant tunnels. So I've mixed. So now I have my 3 containers of ingredients. I have got my eggs and my oil and my vanilla all mixed together. I've got my water, my cocoa, my oil, and my butter all mixed together, and I've got my dry. Now I can just put them together. And what I do is I take this chocolate mixture and I pour it into the dry. And again, I'm going to kind of scrape this because it's kind of amazing how much you can lose by not scraping. I learned that lesson well from old-time bakers in Santa Cruz from this bakery called the Plaza Bakery. I bet if you have grandparents, you might ask them about the Plaza Bakery and they would remember. But they came in once and gave me some tips, and one of them was really to scrape things well if you want exact measuring, which is super important in baking. So when I mix, I really go around the outside. I'm trying to use economy of strokes with my paddle because I don't want to overmix. I'm swooping around. Now, when it's just about to the point where I can't see flour, which I think is there, then I'll put in these ingredients because it's going to get mixed some more now. Again, I'm scraping my bowl to make sure I get everything out of there. You can see how I scoop around when I'm mixing things up. I'm not beating in the middle like that. Not for this recipe. I want to be super gentle. Somehow I want to get it to mix together as best as I can in as few strokes as possible. So we're actually doing pretty well here. You can see I practically folded over to make this happen. You can see how this is a perfect recipe for a giant cake because you can do all this by hand and not have to worry about a mixer. Oh look, we're almost there. I can still see bits of that egg. I'm scraping. Because if I don't scrape, then when I bake it off, some of these cupcakes are going to have a lot more egg than others or a lot more flour than others. Look, I think it's good now. And look, you can start to see the bubbles. You can start to see the leavening. Well, let's stop now because I want that leavening to go off once it's in the oven.
3.
Well, I've transferred my batter into a measuring cup because if I tried to pour it from the bowl, it would be a huge mess. This is going to be so much easier because it's got the porous spigot. I can only do this because it's a smaller batch of batter. If I had a full batch of batter, then I would just fill this twice, but I would still use the liquid measuring cup. When I'm filling the muffin papers, I'm aiming for 3/4 full. But what I'm going to do is put some in each, and then I'll go back and fill up those that maybe aren't as full. I'm trying to time it so that the drips don't happen when I'm moving. Oh, so far I've done pretty well. So now I filled my muffin tins, and I did a pretty good job of not getting the batter all around it. And now we're going to put them in the oven, 325. You know, every time you open the oven, you can lose like 50 degrees. And when that happens, the flames have to come up from the bottom. So you're kind of barbecuing whatever you're cooking, which is not what you want. So whenever you open the oven, you want to do it as quickly as possible. I always make sure I'm prepared. I'm going to pop them in. I also open the oven just as seldom as possible, using the light to look in and using my timer. So I'm going to pop these in the oven, and soon we'll see what they look like when they're done. And now the cupcakes have been in the oven for 15 minutes, and we believe they're done. So safety first, I'm wearing my mitts, open the oven, but actually I do want to touch. Perfect. Some people, when they start baking, not like you, they think something's got to be like really hard to be done, but it's not true. The main thing I want to have happen is for them not to be liquid anymore. And also, once they come out of the oven, they're still baking. They're still hot inside. So if I wait too long, they're going to overbake because they are still cooking right now, even as we speak. So this was 15 minutes, and I think they look just about perfect because I touch them and they bounce back. And now, once they're cool, all the way cool, they could be frosted with your favorite frosting recipe, maybe some simple butter and powdered sugar, a little vanilla, a little milk, or maybe even just whipped cream, which is something I love, with maybe a fresh raspberry on top. The options are limitless.
This is what our cupcakes look like with the chocolate buttercream icing. And here's the recipe for a screenshot. Served plain with the raspberry on top is another delicious way to go.